welcome back to the MRC channel. I'm Taylor Morehouse, your host, and today we're going to have another episode of general modifications and performance topics. I apologize for the lack of videos here the last week. We had some drag racing going on, and it just got too busy for me to make a video. And unfortunately, we didn't have a real good weekend, so I don't have any footage to show of that yet. But as soon as we get a good weekend in with the truck, we will get some footage up. As you can hear, I've got a cold and a pretty nasty cough as well, so hopefully I can get through this without hacking too much. Excuse me. Case in point. Today is going to be one of my favorite topics, which is turbochargers. Turbos are, in my opinion, still pretty misunderstood by the general amount of people starting to modify cars. I'm not going to really go into depth with how turbos work because there's plenty of videos on the internet for that. But essentially, you're taking wasted exhaust energy and using it to drive a turbine, which is connected to a compressor to pump air into the engine. And with that extra air, you can add some extra fuel, make more horsepower. Now, like a lot of people think it's just the motion of the exhaust across the wheel that actually spins the turbo up, but that's not true. It's the expanding exhaust energy that actually drives that turbine. So it's one reason why rear-mounted turbos don't work as well as turbos mounted in the proper way, which is right off the cylinder head, because you need that heat to drive the turbine, and the further away you move it, the more delay there is, and the less heat available, the less energy available, because you are losing it to ambient air along the way. So when turbocharging an engine, the proper size is key. An engine with too large of a turbo is not going to take full advantage of that turbocharger's compressor map, because it's not going to be able to spin the turbo up early enough to make a usable power band. You can have a 2-liter engine and have a massive turbo on it that will make lots of power at 8,000 RPM. And if you can only rev it to 9,000, you've got a 1,000 RPM power band, which is not very usable. Maybe in a drag racing situation, something like that could possibly be usable, but for the majority of people watching this on a street car, you're not gonna want that. You're gonna want something that's very responsive and has a really long, wide torque band or boost band to give you the most drivable results. On the flip side, too small is also bad, because too small of a turbocharger on a certain sized engine will overspin that turbocharger if you're trying to target a boost pressure that the turbo has a hard time hitting. And if you overspin a turbo, it can lead to catastrophic failure. It can also wear the bearings out really fast, and you could cause irreversible damage to your engine if something lets go in that respect. You'll wipe the bearings out rather quickly if you overspin it, so it could actually explode as well. Going back to properly sizing, most of the time, in my experience now, running through a lot of data and sensors, is most turbocharged setups have too much compressor for the exhaust side. Now, obviously, there is a lot of instances where they can be properly matched, but if somebody's just buying a turbocharger off of the shelf just because Joe Blow's running it, you're going to find that most of the time they're not properly matched, or it takes a little work to get it properly matched. And it's not to say you won't have good results if it's not perfectly matched, but you'd have better results if you could fine-tune some of the properties of that turbo to make the full use of it. So usually most people are using all of the turbine side and not enough of the compressor side. There's usually extra compressor left over. Again, not always the case, but usually that's what I see happening. So going back to that a little bit, the more cylinders you have in an engine, the more exhaust volume you're going to create, typically. Obviously, with horsepower to horsepower, it can get somewhat similar, but with usually the more cylinders you have, the more exhaust you're going to have. And that usually means you're going to need a larger exhaust side on your turbo to handle the additional flow to get that exhaust out of the turbo. If your exhaust is too small on the turbine side, you're going to choke the engine up. and that's going to lead to a really poor relationship of boost to back pressure, and you're essentially making the capacity of your engine smaller. If you've got a 5-liter engine, V8, and you got a small itty bitty single turbo on it, and you've got, let's say, 80 pounds of back pressure to 20 pounds of boost pressure, you have a bad relationship there, and it's going to create reversion and have a bunch of exhaust sticking around in the cylinders, and you now have a 2.5-liter engine at 20 pounds of boost. And that's obviously not good for making power. You can still make power, but you're making it with a lot smaller area inside that combustion chamber. So with a V8 or something that's got more cylinders, typically you're going to need more exhaust flow. And there are two relationships on turbos that dictate exhaust flow. You have your turbine wheel size, and you also have your turbine housing size. The turbine size is going to really dictate the flow on the exhaust side, but also the response of the turbo as well. Because if you have a small wheel, it's easier to spin up, easier to get the turbo to start to spool. But you'll choke the engine up top. So you're going to have more low-end power, but you're going to struggle up top. Going the other way with a large turbine wheel, you get more exhaust flow, but you have a lot more mass to spin up. So it takes longer. It's going to be laggier. It's going to be a little bit more doggy on the street. So you got to find that ratio. And you also have the option of different housing sizes. So for one wheel size, you may have 3 or 5 different turbine housings, larger or smaller. Again, larger is going to give you more flow, outright flow. A smaller one is going to give more turbine drive. So you can change the characteristic of even the same turbocharger just by changing the exhaust housing size. And that's another thing that creates a lot of issues, is people think that their engine is built for a certain amount of boost. And that does not make any sense to somebody that understands how turbocharging works. Obviously, boost is going to make power, but for instance, a factory turbocharger on a Mitsubishi Evo is out of the factory at 19 psi. But if you jump to a much larger turbocharger, 19 psi is going to give you a lot more power than it did on the stock turbo, because you've opened up the exhaust more, you've essentially let that engine breathe better, and you're going to make more power. My case in point being the S10 drag truck. It's a 406 cubic inch small block Chevy with a single Garrett turbo on it. Last year we had a GTX 47 turbine on it. This year we have a GTX 55. We've jumped up 2 turbine sizes larger with essentially the same size compressor. We weren't using all of the compressor on the 120 millimeter compressor wheel with an 88 inducer, and now we're up to a 98, which can create more airflow, but we aren't using that much yet. But we made around 1,450 horsepower on 33 pounds of boost on the smaller turbine wheel. When we jumped up and didn't change anything else, we're making that same 1,450 horsepower at 18 pounds of boost. So we have dropped about 15 pounds of boost, and we're actually making the same power, which is because the exhaust back pressure was so much over the boost on that smaller GTX 4720 that now going up to a 5533, we're gaining a lot more exhaust flow. And you can see that on the back pressure sensor, because the back pressure is actually lower than the boost pressure. And that is the kind of magical number for drag racing, because you make so much power with adding boost. You're not restricting that engine. And with a large displacement engine such as a 406, there's a lot of exhaust flow, so you need to get rid of it to make the power that you want to make. So boost does not always mean the amount of power you're going to make. It just depends on the turbo size and the setup of the engine. More boost doesn't necessarily always mean more power. You can also jump to a larger turbo and run less boost and make the same power. A little bit more on turbo housings. There's a few different styles that, if you are getting into turbocharging, you've probably noticed the terms T25, T3, T4, T6, and V-band. Now, the V-band is probably the most modern option, and it is, in my opinion, the best because there's no gaskets. It allows you to rotate that turbo on the mount, on the flange, on the exhaust manifold, and it flows the best. Number two, the benefit is most V-band housings these days are stainless steel. And stainless steel is a very poor conductor of heat, so it keeps the heat inside the turbine, which actually aids in spool up. And they are also lighter and more compact, and they flow better. So the new stainless steel housings like Tile makes, and this is not, I'm not sponsored by Tile, but I do believe that their products are by far and away the best, and always had good luck with them. It's what we're running on the S10 drag truck, is a big giant V-band stainless steel housing, and we've had awesome results with it. Jumping back to the T4 and T3 stuff, especially T4, you're going to notice that there are twin scroll options or single scroll. Twin scroll means there are 2 entries into the turbocharger. Single scroll means 1. Typically, a twin scroll is going to spool up much quicker than a single scroll. The downside is you need 2 wastegates. You need to keep those separate sides with companion cylinders separated. So you need 2 wastegates, 2 dump tubes, and it gets a little bit more complex, and it obviously for trying to fit all that stuff in there can be difficult on a tight engine bay. However, the twin scroll setup usually has trouble on the high end with flow. So most of your race turbos you're going to find are single scroll. And with today's turbocharger technology, the single scroll turbos are spooling up as quick as the older twin scroll setups. So it's a lot less weight, a lot less complexity, a lot more area and space when you're using a single scroll turbo. You'll also find that some turbos aren't even offered in a twin scroll. So single's the only way you got to go. You just have to make sure that your manifold matches whatever your turbo is. So if you buy a twin scroll turbo, you got to have a twin scroll manifold. You can buy adapters, but you're really defeating the purpose at that point. So always kind of, you got to keep it in mind that it's a overall package. It's not just buy the turbo, buy a manifold, bolt it together. So you got to have a little more thought into it than that. The pressure ratio and compressor map is one thing you want to look at when buying a turbo. Compressor maps can be a little difficult to read or understand right away, but if you look into it a little more, and I'll go in just a basic explanation, a compressor map is basically where that turbo is the most efficient. Where is it going to most efficiently compress the air? The more efficiently that you can compress the air, the more power you're going to get out of it, the less you heat that air up. And you're going to find that on a compressor map, there's a lot of lines, but there's a middle island section that is going to be the most efficient. And that's where you want to hunt for on your engine. And there's going to be a pressure ratio on the left side, and you can look that up on plenty of other videos to explain what the pressure ratio is. But it's essentially the amount of boost that you're running. There's a few more things that play into it to get that number, but a pressure ratio is simply how much more pressure is the turbo putting out than is going in. And some turbos do much better at really high pressure ratios. For instance, on a 2-liter engine, if you're making a lot of power, you might have to run 40 pounds of boost. You're going to want a turbo that's efficient at those really high pressure ratios. On a V8, you might only need 15 pounds of boost. You want a turbo that's got a really low pressure ratio efficiency island to give you the best efficiency you can get. And the compressor map is really awesome to have. It isn't an end-all to choosing the right turbocharger. I know a lot of guys, and me included, that have run far off of the compressor map and made really good horsepower. So it's just a good general guideline to choose the right turbo for your application. Ball bearing versus journal bearing. Both good setups, but the ball bearing is obviously more expensive. It's more expensive, but you are trading cost with benefits. A ball bearing turbo is going to spool up much quicker than a ball bearing turbo. It's typically going to last longer if you're pushing it harder, and you're going to get better transient response. And transient response is on and off throttle. It's going to feel like the turbo is more connected to your right foot. It's hard to explain, but when you drive a car with the same engine with both different turbos, you notice right away when it's ball bearing. Typically, a ball bearing turbo will take less oil pressure, so you'll run a restrictor on the oil feed line, typically on a ball bearing turbo. But you never want to run a restrictor on a journal bearing turbo unless you have very high oil pressure, over 100 psi or over 80 psi. Usually the manufacturer will specify in the turbo if you need a restrictor. But generally speaking, journal bearing turbos do not need restrictors. If you're blowing oil and smoke out of your turbo, you've probably got an issue on the oil drain side of things, not on the feed side. There are also some ball bearing turbos that don't require a reducer or a restrictor, like the Zoner rotor. I got in touch with them for my Supra 2JZ engine, and they told me that unless the pressure is well over 80, you don't need a you don't need a restrictor on that turbo. You should run full oil pressure. So I found that a little interesting. So always check with your turbo manufacturer to see if you need a restrictor or not. But typically, a -3 line is sufficient on a ball bearing turbo. -4 AN style hose for a journal bearing turbo. The return you want as big as you can. Usually a -10 is what most people will run, and you want to make sure that that drain line, which is gravity fed, is always pointed downhill. You don't want to go up and into the block. You don't want to make it go uphill, because you will find that your turbo smokes terribly if you do that. So try and make it as straight as possible, as right down into the oil pan or the sump that you can on the oil drain, because that oil is foamy when it comes out of the turbo, and it needs a lot of area to get sliding down that and get out of that turbo cavity, bearing cavity. The wastegate and the runner sizes on your manifolds excuse me, plays a very important role in the turbocharger system as well. The size of the runner is going to kind of dictate where you can make the power and how much power you can make. Putting really big runners on a lower horsepower car, even like a 500, 600 horsepower four-cylinder, you're going to notice that the spool suffers slightly, because with a bigger pipe, the same amount of exhaust is going to flow slower through that pipe. You lose velocity, which also means you're going to lose some turbo drive pressure at low RPM and low power levels. So on a street car, you typically run a smaller runner size to increase torque and drivability. High-end horsepower, you want a bigger one to get more exhaust flow through that turbo. It's always going to be a compromise. You can't do both. Wastegate sizing is kind of difficult too. There's some formulas out there that you can use on the internet to kind of decide if it's big enough. But generally speaking, the higher the boost you're going to run, the smaller the wastegate that you need. You don't want to put a 60 millimeter wastegate on a 2-liter four-cylinder that you plan to run 50 pounds of boost, because as soon as that huge valve opens, you're going to dump all the exhaust pressure out of it and you're going to lose boost. So you actually want to go as small as you can to get the best boost control. However, if you go too small, you're going to run into what they call boost creep. And boost creep simply means the wastegate isn't big enough to release all of that exhaust pressure that you don't want driving the turbo, and your boost is going to slowly creep up and up and up as you go up in RPMs, because you have more exhaust volume that it can't get rid of. It keeps feeding that turbocharger. So keep in mind when choosing a wastegate, because your exhaust has to be built to obviously house the right size wastegate that you want to run. On four-cylinder stuff, usually a 44 millimeter wastegate is plenty. It's the right size. When you start getting into big V8, huge turbo stuff, you could be running a 60 millimeter or two 44s or something like that. And remember, on a twin scroll, you would be running 2 wastegates. There again, you need a smaller wastegate. You'd probably run 38 millimeter wastegates on a twin scroll setup, because you don't usually need to get rid of that much exhaust. So the wastegate is also important to properly size. And you should also choose a manifold that has a wastegate tube coming off of the branch, coming off of the manifold, so that the exhaust flows through it. You shouldn't have an exhaust wastegate that's pointed the opposite of the direction of flow. You don't want the exhaust traveling this way and then has to make a bend and go down to the wastegate, because you're not going to get very good boost control that way. So if you're buying a manifold, make sure that it looks like the wastegate itself has a good flow path for the exhaust, and that's going to give you the best results on boost control. Talking about boost control, there are really kind of three methods that I would say that you can use. A manual boost controller is obviously the tried and true old method, but nowadays with modern electronics, you can do a lot more with boost control than you ever could previously, and much easier. Manual boost control, all it does is interrupt the signal to the wastegate. So it will delay the valve opening to allow you to build more boost. Electronic boost control nowadays, with ECU controlling the amount of boost, is much better because you can modulate that boost a lot easier. You can change the boost based on a number of conditions, and there's two different ways to do that. You can do the kind of conventional boost control where you use a single port on the wastegate to run the boost, and you've also got dome control, and dome control will allow you to build even more boost than a single port setup. So when buying a wastegate, we can go into boost control in another day, but basically if you buy a tile wastegate, you're going to have the option to use one or both ports on that wastegate. You can block one off and use it either way you want, so it works really good. Size of turbos, or I should say the number of turbos. Twin turbos. Twin turbos on a 4-cylinder, not really going to give you a whole lot of benefit. Twin turbos on something like a 6-cylinder or an 8-cylinder is a lot different, because we were talking about exhaust flow before. If you think about a 6-liter engine, V8, like an LS, you've got 3 liters per side. Well, when you think about a 4-cylinder like a Mitsubishi or something, you've only got 2 liters there, maybe 2.4 if you've got a stroker in it. And so you really don't have a whole lot of exhaust flow. You've got 3 liters. You essentially have a Supra engine on each bank. So trying to run that through one turbo means you need a huge turbo just for the exhaust side of things. Even though you might not be using that much compressor side, it makes it difficult to size a turbo for a low horsepower and be really efficient with it. Not bad for a street setup. A lot of guys do that and it works really well. But for really high performance stuff, it gets a little bit more difficult. Twins on like a Supra, 2JZ or something, they work well because you're essentially doing half the amount of work per 3 cylinders. You're running 2 turbos with smaller inertia on the wheels because everything is so much smaller, so they'll usually have much better response than a big single. However, with twins, you have more complexity. You have 2 oil lines, 2 oil drains, more plumbing, more exhaust work, 2 downpipes. You have a lot more work involved with a set of twins, and a lot more weight too. Now on a V8, twins become very, very, it's probably the best option for a bigger V8 because you can get rid of that exhaust flow much easier with 2 turbos, which you can more properly size when you break them down into twins. Whereas if you go one giant single, there isn't a lot of options to make that work really well with a lot of different goals. Big singles work awesome for a lot of horsepower, but finding a super well-designed single setup can be a little bit harder. And you got a lot more exhaust work there too with a single. You got crossover pipes to make it all work and all that stuff. So I think that is a pretty good general idea on turbocharging. If you have any questions, leave them down in the comments below. Please, if you enjoyed this video or learned something, please subscribe, and we will see you on the next episode. So thank you for watching. Thank you for subscribing. Have a good one. Goodbye.